Okay, so this is an overview of our Flash lecture. Um, Before we get started, I need to let you know that my layout's probably a little bit different than yours by default because I went to Window Workspaces Classic. This is just a teaching mechanism to put the timeline up top so you guys can see it. All right, so the reason we teach Flash in this class is so that you can kind of get an idea of just what's involved in animation. So if you watch this and are thinking this seems complicated, it seems like a lot of steps to do very little, you're not wrong. All right, but a lot of this should at least start to look familiar now that we've used a lot of different programs. You got a toolbar over here. Layers will be over here once I open something. And then all your properties for anything are going to be over on this panel rather than on the top like we've seen. All right, so you can go File, New, same as before. Make sure you choose Action Scripting 3.0. It might default to this. Don't use this one down here. And you can set the size of things. We're going to change it later to match what we're importing. But just know that, width, height, you usually want to measure things in pixels. And the frame rate I will talk about in a minute. So hit OK, and now you can see I have a layer. I can always add layers if I wanted to. I don't want to. And I can now use my tools. And whatever tool I have selected, the properties for it show up here, if there are relevant properties. Sometimes there's not. Some of these tools don't have anything as far as properties. All right. Just like in Illustrator, you have a fill color and a stroke color. And somewhat like in Illustrator, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I like having space. There we go. Things are vector. I'm putting it to the default that you guys have. So if I draw something out like this, right, I can always select the edge here. Or actually, I'm going to select the fill. Yeah, I can select the fill and change the color to something different. I can also zoom in forever. And the only pixelation you guys will see will simply be in the render of the video you're watching on television. But if you zoom into your own stuff on your own computer, you're not going to see any pixelation whatsoever. It's going to be very, very clean. Now, one of the strange things Flash does that Illustrator does not do, right? Illustrator, if I go to Illustrator right here, you can see that on each layer it keeps everything separate. So even if I take something and overlap it, right, the two things are still separate things. You can actually see them being selected over here. In Flash, not always. If I bring up a different shape here, I'm going to just give it a, there we go. And I do this. Once I let go, you'll have this happen. I go to select this, move it. Oh, there's a hole punched in it. So it's not entirely like Photoshop where everything blends together permanently, because you'll remember in Photoshop we had to use magic wand tools and all sorts of crazy stuff to separate out colors. But these things do interact. For those of you who are interested, if you want this to behave more like Illustrator, there's a circle inside a square right here under your tools called Object Drawing. If you turn this on, let me choose another color here. You see this bounding box? Now it will behave like Illustrator, where, whoops, this does not interact with these things. They won't show up here. There will be no different things in the layer, but at least you can treat them more like vector objects. If you want to kind of change something, you have to double click to go inside it. All right, but that's getting a little further into things than we want to. So if you want to explore the basic drawing tools in Flash, you can. I usually recommend people make stuff in other programs and then bring them in here later, which is what we are going to do. So what the homework assignment was that we did mostly in class was to take the elements of your header, right, your name and your icon, and have them going to animate them a little bit. Basically, we're going to slide the text in and we're going to fade in this part, right? Real simple. But that means we actually want to grab this stuff from Illustrator because you don't want to design it again. That's stupid. It's a waste of time. So before we bring stuff in from Illustrator, it's always a good idea to kind of organize things. So layer 1 here, that's just all this other stuff that I don't care about. Header text is all the text, right? Name, what I do, and this one line here. and then header icon is the icon. Now, if, for example, I want this one to be under text and not the icon, I just want maybe the arrow part to be under the icon, it's really easy to move things. So I twirl this down, and in Illustrator, it shows you what's selected by this little highlight right here, right? Like it's a little green. If you have lots of stuff selected, like they're all turn green. It's whatever color your layer is. So this one's green, this one's red, this one's blue. But it highlights it. And you can take it, click on it, and drag it into the layer. Now, if you're dragging it into a layer, you're going to see that layer kind of highlights a little bit lighter, right? Not in the layer, in the layer. Right? There we go. So now it's on that different layer, and it's with the text. The other thing you can do, if it matters, is click one of these things and within the layer put one on top of the other. It's the same as object, arrange, send to back, send to front, but it's a little more direct. I usually use this. I don't usually go up here. All right, so we've got that. We made a change, so we have to save it, because if you don't save it, it won't register the change in the actual file, and whatever you bring into Flash will be the old version. The other thing you have to do, and this is kind of funny, but there are 3 artboards, right? We made a header artboard, a business card, and an icon. Flash will take in whichever one you have selected here. So it's basically whichever one you clicked on last. So I usually like to just make sure I'm on the header and I hit Control S to save. And that should bring it in. Push to shove, if you can't get it to bring in the right thing, just take all the stuff you want and copy paste it into a new Illustrator file that only has one artboard. You shouldn't have to do that, but occasionally, things don't always work. So, bringing stuff into Flash. You cannot open an Illustrator file in Flash. This isn't like Photoshop where you open a JPEG and then another one and then another one and you have all those tabs. If you go File, Open, it only lets you open other Flash files. So, we have to go File, Import. And we're going to say Import to Stage. And it's bringing me somewhere crazy that I was before, so I have to find my Illustrator file. I like that they're color-coded. I think this is the one I was working on. Let's check. Yes, header 1. That means I downloaded it more than once. And we hit Open. And it's going to take a second. And another second. There you go. So you want to keep everything as the default. What that's going to do is make sure everything is still vector. You can edit it. It's going to convert the different layers that are in the file into Flash layers. So when I hit OK, you get 2 different layers. So all my stuff is still separated, right? This is the icon. This is the text. This works out nice. We're going to give it a little more space. And now you can see that obviously this is the wrong size. So what we're going to do is we're going to click anywhere on the background. I said before that whatever you have selected, the properties will show up here on the right-hand side. Well, that includes the actual document. If you want to change the size of the document, you click the background, which is the document. And we come over here. If I recall correctly, the header was 1200 by 200. You'll see it takes it off the bottom. It considers this top left-hand corner to be like 0, 0. So it takes it off the side here and it takes it off the bottom. There's nothing you can do to change that. Alright, my stage background, I could make this a different color. I don't want to. I want it to stay white because that's how it's designed, but you can make it whatever color you want. Alright, and we have this stuff on 2 different layers for very good reasons. We need to, anytime you animate something in Flash, they need to be on their own layers. So everything that's in this header icon right here, that has to be all on one layer. And anything that's moving in a different manner has to be on a different layer. So if you could imagine if you have puppets with lots of different pieces, each single piece, left foot, left hand, head, left eye, right eye, those all have to be separate layers. Alright, but now we need to prep this for animation because it's not quite ready. So in order to do that, I need to select all of the different pieces. Now I could come in here and try and drag select stuff, but you'll see up in the layers that it's selecting stuff from both layers. I don't want that. A trick is to just click on the layer name and it will automatically select anything on that layer. So now we need to do something that's very specific to Flash. In order to kind of prep this for animation, We have to go modify, convert to symbol. Symbols are unique to Flash. Sorry, I'm moving this to the default. And they're basically a type of object. That's really all you need to know right now. And we need them to be movie clips under type. And I'm going to call it icon just so I know what it is. And I hit OK. And then I'm going to click on the layer that says header text because, again, I want everything to be selected. And I go modify, convert to symbol, still a movie clip, and I call it the text, right? And so now this should, yep, that's all that stuff, that's all this stuff. You want to always make sure, before you go too far that you've got everything on the right layer. Okay, so now we've got all of our stuff prepped for animation, but how are we going to animate? I'm going to make my frames a little bit bigger so you guys can see them. So this is the timeline, and you can see that each layer has its own kind of layer on the timeline. It's not just the name and the eyeball to turn it invisible and the lock to lock it, right? We've got all of these frames. Film animation is measured in frames. It's back from when we actually used to have actual film, and each frame was a square of film that took the picture at that particular moment, and when you strung them all together, you had a film reel. Digitally speaking, it's just a lateral timeline, but it's the same idea. And so the more of these you have, the more time you have. How many frames for how much time? Well, when we open the file, I mentioned before that one of your properties, FPS, that's frames per second. We're keeping it at 24. 24 is the default because that's what film is. Traditional American film is at 24. British TV was at 25. Video cameras used to be at 30, like your old-timey soap operas and bad commercials, infomercials, things like that. Those were all on video because they were cheap, so they're 30 frames a second. Your PC video games might run anywhere from 30 to 60 frames a second, depending on how powerful your computer is. And you'll notice when they get choppy because there's too much going on, it can't play all the frames. And when it has a choice between processing what is happening, like in terms of the characters and where you are, and giving you the visual information, it's going to process what's happening and drop visual information. So that's why your videos can get choppy sometimes. Same thing if you're streaming something from YouTube on a bad connection and it kind of gets jumpy, it's dropping frames. Also, a lot of action movies like to do that to make things look quicker. It's cheap. So how do we add frames? Well, there's a couple different ways. We're going to basically do a lot of right-clicking because it gives you all your options. So we're going to go out to frame 50. And I'm going to select that. And right now there's nothing there. This is just a grid to tell you how long something could be. The only thing that exists is frame 1. You can see there's a gray box with a little black dot in it. If there was nothing there on the black dot, I'm just going to do this temporarily. I'm going to get rid of everything. Right? You would see this white sort of empty dot. Undo. There we go. So the black dot tells us there is something on that frame. So I go out to frame 50, I right click, and I can do one of two things. I can insert a frame, right? So what this does is it basically says this thing is going to continue until frame 50, at which point the whole thing stops because there's nothing else there. You'll see that this layer disappears after frame 1 because there's nothing there. Now the other thing I can do at frame 50 is I can right click and I can say insert keyframe. Now visually speaking, you can see the obvious difference. The keyframe, it looks like it's its own separate section. There's a little black dot. Don't worry about these rectangles. They're just a visual cue to be like, you are at the end of a section, beginning new section. They don't do anything. This is not any different than this. But what a keyframe does is, if I move this on this keyframe, and then I go back a frame, see? So keyframes allow you to sort of set guideposts and say, this starts here and ends here. It's obviously a terrible place to end it. I'm gonna I'm gonna undo that, right? But that's how, in order to animate, you have to have change. So you have to have one thing and then the other. Oh, that didn't undo at all. There we go. Control Z for undo, same as every other program. All right, so how to actually get to animating? Well, the way we animate is that Flash will do the in-betweening for us. We only need to set the beginning and then the end. Now the end is where things are now. So if you want to change something, you have to go to that specific time, in this case, the beginning. And I'm going to move this off the screen. And I'm going to hold down Shift so that you can see it's sliding like really smoothly, as opposed to, I don't know where I am. If you hold down Shift, it keeps it locked, right? So that you're either moving perfectly laterally or perfectly vertically. All right, there we go. So I'm going to move that out there. And so far we've just got it stays there, it stays there, it stays there, bang. That's not animation yet, but at least you've got a beginning and an end. The way Flash works is if there's nothing here, it's just gray bar until the end, it's not going to change, which is sometimes what you want. But not this time. Obviously, we want it to animate from here to here, and we don't want to have to do it frame by frame by frame by frame by frame. That's, tedious. That's how they used to do it in hand-drawn. So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click on this middle section, and you're going to create classic tween, and this is important. When you get into the Flash class, you're going to use the different types of tweening. In here, classic tween only, and it should turn purple. If it turns blue, you use the wrong one. If it turns green, you use the wrong one. Purple, that's the color we want. It's a magic color. And the reason is, this is the tween that works with, you set a beginning, you set an end, and it follows in. I'm dragging the time marker, and I'm scrubbing through time. You can also play to watch it, and it moves. And you didn't have to do 95% of that work because Flash does it for you. Alright, so I said before that we'd be moving some stuff and fading in something else. So in order to fade this in, right, in order to have change, we need a second keyframe. This is not a keyframe, this is just the end of the set of frames. So I have to right click, insert keyframe. You can always do that later. You can always insert a keyframe anywhere, really. Just don't add them in unless you absolutely need them, because if I add in a keyframe here, what's going to happen is it's going to start here. I can move this up here, but it won't be able to animate from here to here because there's this giant section in the middle. So just be careful where you're putting keyframes. Alright, so we got a beginning. We got an end. Obviously the end is where we want it to end up. We want to be able to see it, so we go back to the beginning. And I can click on this now. And there's a difference between being clicked on the timeline and being clicked on the thing. You can see the properties over here changing. But we want to be able to change the transparency. So that is under this thing called color effect, which is a strange place to put it. And you're going to see style. It's going to say none by default. But if you go to alpha and you change the alpha to 0, it vanishes, right? Alpha is how transparent or not something is. 0 is completely transparent. 100 is completely opaque, and all these numbers in the middle are obviously halfway in between. If you see this where two things are overlapping and they're not, it's not treating it as one object, that's not you, that's Flash is stupid, and there's not much we can do about it in this class. Alright, so we set it to 0, it's 100 at the end, I double check, and we right click and we say classic tween, and now it's going to, let me play this here, fade up. It's going to fade up while this is coming in. Alright, so those are the two things that you would want to do. If you want to move more pieces separately, you can do that. Can earn you a little bit of extra. The other thing I would mention is changing the timing. Flash is very, persnickety about selection of your timeline. If you click and just drag, it drag selects the whole thing. It's kind of like drag selecting down here, right? Like you can select multiple objects. If I go to the first, nope, if I go to the last frame, I can select multiple objects, right? You can drag select objects. But if you want to move something, you actually, in the timeline, you have to select it first, let go, and then click and drag, and you can see how it's that single frame, and it's going to move it over there. I said before that more frames equals more time, which means less frames equals less time. So this is going to get to its end before this fades up all the way. Likewise, if I take the beginning of the fading and move it, ooh, stay on the same layer, move it much later, what I get is that this one is almost all the way in by the time this one comes. And actually I want that to be even quicker because I don't like how slow it is, so I'm going to move that a little bit. Right? But this is... Oh. And you can see how much more complex that looks just to have one moving almost all the way in before this one fades in. It just makes it look, you know, a little bit more. Alright, so you can tinker with the timing. You know, tinker with maybe how many pieces you have, but bare minimum, one thing slides in and another thing fades in. I don't want to see all of the things doing both simultaneously. I want to see one do one thing, one do the other. When you are done, you save. Hit save. Obviously, if it's the first time you're saving it, it's gonna... Right? It's gonna ask you what to call it, and you call it something, and you say save. And then that file will look like Flash files. Header, header, header. Oh, it's going to be at the bottom because I just added it. There we go. So it's going to look like this. It's going to be a little red icon. You don't want the white with red writing. That's something different. So if you accidentally make one of those files, don't use it. You can see it's a pretty small file, but this is the file you want to submit. You're going to submit it to under Blackboard, under course content, and then homework. It's technically a homework assignment, but you're going to want to, it's called Flash. It's pretty simple. So hopefully this helps. And like I said, Flash is complicated. This is not an easy software. So there's a lot of steps. Make sure you watch this carefully. Make sure you don't skip any steps. And you want purple tweens. If you get blue or green, that's no good.